Welcome, everybody, to a Neutrality Studies Japan election night special. Today is the great night of Japan's general election, where Japan is deciding on a new lower house, the more powerful of the two chambers. And in order to discuss what's happening as the exit polls are coming out, I am joined today by two of my favorite Asian analysts, Mr. Einar Tangen and Dr. Warwick Powell. Einar is a senior fellow at the CIGI think tank. I even wrote down that is the Center for International Governance Innovation. And Warwick Powell is an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. Einar, Warwick, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great having you both. And just before we go into the discussion, I would like to share with everybody what we know about the where we stand. Wait, let me see if I can share this. The the chatter of the last week has been that the polling conducted by the news agencies in Japan actually revealed that the snap election that was called should render a large win for the governing party, but the governing party, which so far was actually relatively weak. So the predictions were that the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, would certainly win more than a majority. That would be 233 seats of the lower house. But anything up until even a two-thirds majority was said to be within the range of the possible, and a two-thirds majority would be 310 seats. Now, for everybody to understand, we are talking about these parties over here that were running or competing for re-election, and a lot of things happened over the last couple of days. The reason we had this new election is that Sanae Takaichi, the person who was made prime minister in November 2025, she called for it. She has the power to dissolve parliament. She did, and now in February 8, we are now having today this update, and the main parties competing for power are the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP. Then we've got the centrist party, which actually renamed itself. The old name was the Constitutional Democratic Party, the CDP, the center-left party that went through several changes and now is actually competing under a new name, under the Central Party. It merged with another party, and that's one of the things we probably need to discuss later. We've got Nippon Ishin no Kai, a right-wing party, then that is now in coalition actually with the LDP. We've got the Democratic Party for the People, usually they're called the DPP, also a center conservative party that came up and is relative new, the Reiwa Shinsengumi and the Japanese Communist Party. Those are about the ones that are most popular. But you see the difference, and what you're seeing here in front of you is the seat distribution of the past, of the outgoing parliament, where the governing party, the LDP, had almost 200 seats, and the centrist reformist party 172. Now, the exit polls that came out just an hour ago are predicting a huge landslide, if I can find it actually. I'm sorry, I don't. Apparently, I closed the window. The exit polls are that the LDP will win 305 seats, up or around 300 seats is the prediction at the moment. The Japanese, we are counting, so we don't have the final results yet, but around 300 is what's being expected. And the CDP, the new center party, they are down to something like 54 or 55 seats. So a huge shift in parliament, and this is of course going to be the power base of the government. So with this out of the way, let's discuss this. Einar and Warwick, when you heard about the popularity of apparently the new prime minister and what this now does to the snap election, what were your thoughts, and how are you making sense of this apparent landslide victory? Maybe Einar first and then Warwick.
Okay, Thank you for having me, Pascal. I cannot be be named as an expert on Japanese politics. I did run elections in the United States. I looked at her message and she was saying, and obviously she has a very populist appeal. I'm sure we'll get into the substance of what she was preaching, but based on what she was promising, it was very, very attractive, especially young people. They're less interested in foreign affairs than they are in, pocketbook issues. And she's promising to change everything with her new capitalism. So yes, I'm not surprised. But now the question is the proof going to be in the pudding? She's going to have a massive landslide, even though she doesn't have the 210. She has allies she can come together with, obviously, and she will be able to, push forward her agenda. But as Warwick and I have discussed before, this is not necessarily a political panacea, because when you have the hammer in your hand and you're not able to get things done the way you promised, there's no one to blame.
Warwick, your initial thoughts?
Yeah, look, large majorities can be a blessing, but especially if you start off on the right foot. But having, like Einar, been involved in political processes, parliamentary elections, they can also be lodestones, because the issues actually don't go away. Reality doesn't bend to the parliamentary numbers. In fact, quite the reverse. The parliamentary numbers ultimately need to figure out a way of dealing with the realities of the situation that politicians find themselves facing. And I think one of the interesting challenges for the new parliament and the government that will have, an absolute stonking majority is how does it actually deal with Japan's myriad strategic challenges, right? So these go to an economic model that has largely been flatlining now for the best part of 2 to 3 decades. It's not to say that Japan's been going backwards. I think it's fair to say that Japanese standard of living is very high. The challenge is what future does it have? Is the structure of its economic system one that is suitable for the second half of the 21st century, with an aging population, with a country that has significant energy and food challenges? How does it cope in an environment where it regionally it has obviously a very significant and growing China on the one hand, but also to its north a resurgent Russia as a Pacific power? Right, so the issues don't go away, but the upside is, with a stonking majority, it does give the government, for a period of time anyway, some breathing space to hopefully stamp some authority on the issues and chart a pathway that a population can get behind. But these things are never easy, and of course what appears to be incredibly strong majorities can evaporate incredibly quickly as well if you don't deliver the goods.
Yeah, that's a very good point. A, it can melt away. B, once you have such a enormous majority, you actually own all that's going to come out of it over the next 4 or so years, supposing that this parliament won't be dissolved again before its day. And just to also make one more point is that the relatively weak LDP, the way that it was here, it does get even stronger if you look at the way that the last upper house elections actually worked out, which is the reason why the previous Prime Minister, Mr. Ishiba, stepped down, because the party fared so poorly. Now, over the course of 3.5, 4 months, basically the party really reestablished its grip on power, and much of it had to do with the appeal of Sanae Takaichi, the leader and prime minister of Japan, and she tried very hard to make this election about her cabinet. She kept repeating ad nauseum, I want to know if the people support my cabinet. I want to know if they support my cabinet. And of course, knowing that she is one of the most popular prime ministers of the past decades, That's a very appealing message, and apparently it has really helped to drive the point home. But this is not the first time that the LDP wins very big. Even in my memory, the 2014 election, if we just look at that, the LDP under Prime Minister Abe, who then ruled for 7-8 years, actually, or 6-7 years, as a very strong Japanese prime minister. There, the LDP basically also was very close to a 2/3 majority, and together with their coalition party at the time, the Komeito, they did have a 2/3 majority. However, the impact, for instance, on the Japanese constitution was much smaller than people feared. There was no change of the constitution. Actually, there were a couple of important changes, but overall, what this proved at the time was, even with a 2/3 majority, you cannot do everything. Now, if they indeed this time win, the governing the LDP actually wins almost 310 seats together with their coalition partner. They're way over 2/3, but there will be very real constraints. Einar, what do you think are the constraints that will weigh on the new cabinet or the new political configuration one way or another?
Well, you have enormous expectations that she sold to the people, and the question is, how is she going to get this done? Her new capitalism is a fudge box of all sorts of very odd ideas. She's borrowed something from Shinzo Abe. She's borrowed trickle down from Reagan. She's borrowed populism from Donald Trump. But it doesn't mean it adds up to a solution. Remember, you can change governments, but you don't change the problems. And as Warwick mentioned, Japan's problems have been in the making since 1986. Literally, 30 years ago, just with the Plaza Accords, basically linking them to the dollar, in essence, subjecting them to much more sideways movement than things. And I believe I'm still correct in saying that the Japanese economy is worth less today in real dollar terms than it was in 1986. This was a situation where the U.S. Does not brook any kind of a challenge. And at that time, for people who don't know it, you had senators and congressmen, CEOs out there with hammers and chainsaws, basically taking apart Japanese products on television, slamming them down. You had monster car rallies where they would crush Toyota trucks and cars, and everyone would scream and yell and say what a great thing that was. And in fact, everything that they were saying at that time about Japan, that it was subsidizing its industries, that this was an attempt to take over the United States, to undermine its competitiveness. These are all things that are being said about China today. So there's a real pattern there. And this is the factor that we talk about Japan. The question is, what happens with the United States? Yes, they kind of avoided the worst of the tariffs, but a strong candidate like her, who is dedicated to right-wing principles, LDP might have been created by the United States, but the fact is, they're a very proud group, very nationalistic, and it's clear that if they had their way, the United States would not have military bases, especially in Okinawa, where it is an ongoing open sore for a very proud people to be, in essence, an occupied entity for these since the end of World War II. And at the same time, the question is, well, what about the nuclear issue? Obviously, we have a de facto North Korea that has the nuclear issues. Things. Now, you asked me about domestic issues. The reason I'm talking about these other issues is they're going to come up in sharp detail. If she, in fact, goes against the United States, or is perceived to, you could see action by Donald Trump. He doesn't recognize friends or neighbors or anything like this, as we have seen. And a lot of her domestic promises and assumptions are based on the logistics system, current pricing, tariffs, basically a status quo, a static entity. And I can guarantee you over the next 3 years, nothing is going to be static. And that's where I'm saying I do not believe her mixture of things work. It's Shinzo Abe light. She doesn't have the structural reforms that he wanted to implement, but was not able to. And I see this coming to a crashing end. And at some point, she may be asked to leave by the party because she is not able to deliver on all of these high-ranking promises. Remember, since these were bread and butter issues, she has a short period of time with the Japanese public to make good on these things, throwing lots of money into the equation with the idea that she's stimulating the economy and she's going to get inflation restarted, and she's going to restart all these nuclear things and all these business things are going to do, and lots of investment. Where's it coming from? It's all coming from debt. You know, a country that's already 250% of its GDP in debt as it is, although there are mitigating factors in terms of how they do that, it's still based on an assumption of working carry trade with U.S. bonds and things like this. If she's going to continue that, you could see real warping effects. And then how do you unwind it? And this is something that the United States and Japan have in common. They do not have any plan in place to deal with the macroeconomic issues that they've created over these many, many years.
One of the things that surprised me is that in all of her speeches right now before the election, she actually said and tried to convince the population that a weak yen is a good thing. She kept saying like a weak yen means we can export more. This is going to be a windfall for our export industry. Warwick, outside the question why that seems to have worked, but do you believe that this can be a winning strategy?
Well, probably not. I mean, I think the structural problem, if you will, that the Japanese economy has been mired in now for the best part of 2 decades or more is that it's essentially a system that is heavily indebted, but not in a generic sense. You know, we can throw around the word debt a lot, of course, and it provokes or invokes some strong reactions, but it has very specific manifestations in the Japanese context, and that is extremely high asset prices, which actually, you know, creates wealth on balance sheets, but it actually doesn't generate economic activity. Right? So you've got paper wealth, which is highly concentrated amongst those who own capital, but there's actually limited growth in real economic activity in terms of production and circulation. Now, you know, whether or not Japan's going to boost its exports or not is not really going to make a huge difference to that particular structure of things. And part of her challenge, even if that is the objective, is who's she going to export to? Or more to the point, I shouldn't say who's she going to export to, but who are the firms in Japan going to export to, and what will they export? Are they going to increase their exports to the United States? Well, I'm not sure how long that's going to last, if that's the ambition, because President Trump's broad strategic focus is to ensure that that actually doesn't happen at all. The whole point of tariffs is to mitigate the cost competitiveness of exports into the United States market. So if the new government's fundamental economic strategy is premised on the idea of improved export competitiveness with a view to exporting to the United States, well, she's probably going to be buying some trouble from Washington. Who else is she targeting for these export markets? There are some high-tech things, of course, that that Japan's well known for, but these days they are in a very competitive global environment, and the most significant global competitors, of course, come from manufacturers in China. But not only that, Japanese manufacturing is actually intimately integrated into global supply chain systems that in a sense, you've just got to be a bit careful what you wish for. Sure, a weakened yen will improve export competitiveness, but a weakened yen also makes it more expensive to buy imported components, etc. Right. So what you gain on one side, you can certainly lose on the other. And so again, I just don't think that these sort of slogan-driven solutions are ultimately going to help Japan navigate its long-term structural challenges. And frankly, its structural challenges go to energy dependency, food dependency, and and a nuclearized Korean peninsula. You know, they are its fundamental challenges, and nothing that I've seen to date says that the Japanese body politic, and particularly the LDP, which has in effect run Japan for, you know, for almost all of the years since the Second World War, is equipped to handle those at this point in time. You know, really challenging times ahead. Great mandate, but at the end of the day, reality bats last, and it's going to present challenges to the political class that I think they're going to struggle to deal with.
If we now suppose that, as the polls seem to indicate, and let's just have a look here again, as we stand, there's of course still counting, but you see there's no question that the ruling party actually is going to win big, right? If we suppose that, okay, this mandate is going to be short of the 310 as the LDP, but much more, quite a bit more than the 2/3 majority together with their coalition partner. Last time we had such a strong coalition under Shinzo Abe, one of the things he was able to do, which surprised me, is actually he was able to mend ties with South Korea. Despite being a right-winger, despite being also quite revisionist when it comes to the wartime history, he did try to mend ties as much as possible. And in 2015, making even a deal with then what's her name, President Park, that the Japanese would provide $10 million for a fund to work on the comfort women issue and so on. And that deal in the end was sunk about half a year later because President Park lost power and was booted out, and that agreement was actually for her. For the guy, Mr. Moon, who came after her, was an easy target because it was unpopular with the South Koreans. But the fact that was possible from the Japanese side was because this right-wing government had a relatively strong mandate. Einar and then Warwick, what do you think are the things in foreign policy that are possible with a strong national mandate?
Well, that's the real question, and that's what I was alluding to earlier. I don't want to repeat myself, but she's in a very uncertain environment internationally, as Warwick pointed out. If she thinks she's going to export a lot of stuff to the United States, well, that's not a long-term given. Knowing Donald Trump will be back demanding more tariffs because he says you're being unfair to the United States. Right now, things are extremely dicey with China. And remember, underpinning all of this, that automobile export and a lot of the high-tech exports are dependent on these rare earth elements. Also, as Warwick pointed out, there are so many, the integrated supply chain. This could be quite damaging to any kind of industrial output. Now, remember, with a weak yen, it sounds great. We're going to sell for less. But actually, that doesn't mean that you can buy for less. So you're going to be buying more expensively and then shipping things out. How much value added is being put in Japan is the real question, because that's the only factor where you get an additional punch out of this idea of a weaker yen. And if she's trying to raise wages at the same time as it's more expensive to import, especially food and also energy, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. I mean, she has all of these ideas. Like I said, I don't think that they are very rational. They don't hold together. And as I said, they make a lot of assumptions to which I can, say with 100% certainty are not going to be, carried out over the next 3 years.
Warwick, what do you think are the things possible with a strong mandate?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think strong mandates are a double-edged sword, so they need to be handled with care. There are some delicate balances. There is no doubt that Takaichi comes from a particularly strong nationalist arm or wing of the LDP. She certainly draws, I think, significant support politically from the more nationalist-oriented parts of the Japanese body politic. But the delicate path that needs to be trod not only is domestic, but it's also regional, because countries around the region are highly sensitive to excessive Japanese nationalism, particularly if it borders on any chance or inkling of a remilitarized Japan. Many parts of Southeast Asia and North Asia remember all too well the legacies of Japanese militarization from the 1920s through to the 1940s. And I think as much as she draws significant domestic political support from the nationalist arm of the Japanese body politic, as Prime Minister, she needs to tread very carefully at a regional level, particularly given that Japan's economic situation is intimately intertwined with supply chains across the region. So it's not like she has a blank slate to work with. So I think that there are some immediate constraints there. I think the other issue on the sort of broader global or regional front is that with a strong mandate, there is actually the chance of striking some deals, if you will, that might reshape the regional context. And I can think of a number of historic examples, not in Japan, but elsewhere, where prime ministers with new governments and strong majorities actually strike out on pathways that weren't expected when they were elected, but nonetheless, they exploited the fact that they had a window to do something that they knew they had to do, but which would have otherwise have been very, very difficult to accomplish. Whether or not she's got the policy vision and the policy bravura to pull off something like that at a regional level, I think time will tell. I'm not entirely optimistic about that because I don't think that she's shown a track record of somebody who thinks particularly expansively. So in terms of the regional and international relationships dimensions of the new Takaichi government, as much as she can talk tough domestically, the regional landscape, I think, is going to hem her in quite a lot. And of course, we know that prior to the election, there were the remarks last year concerning the Taiwan question, which has caused a very strong backlash from Beijing, and that reaction isn't going to go away anytime soon. And that's likely to be a challenge that she's going to have to navigate in the first 3 to 6 months of her new term.
Well, let's discuss this. I mean, Einar, what do you think will China make out of this? That this party and this party leader, who they really made an effort to point out that these kind of remarks can't stand. This is a red line. Taiwan is a red line, and Prime Minister Takaichi crossed that line, and the reaction was huge, right? Including telling Chinese citizens not to go on holidays to Japan, and massive numbers of flights canceled because people canceled their flights. And also the media in China actually taking this very, very negatively and being reminded, of course, of the Second World War and of the wording and the framing of Japan's national security, threatened by what which then became, of course, the war, the war in China, 15 years of devastation and so on. Something that the Japanese, unfortunately, and especially this government, don't have much. Not sympathy, but empathy for. They've rather made a point out of trying to portray themselves as standing up to China and holding their ground. Now that they did, and now that this seems to have been also successful with the voters, what will China make out of it?
Well, I mean, China's not concerned about the domestic situation in Japan. I mean, you have to remember the Chinese government has numerous, many hundreds of think tanks who play out scenarios and they look at things. They're well aware of what's happening there. But I think they would come to the same conclusion that Warwick and I have, which is how's she going to make this work? Has she, in essence, overpromised and will not be able to deliver? And then the question is, who comes in after her? When I think of different scenarios, and I was just thinking about this when Warwick was talking. What could she do that would be absolute breakaway? Well, if for some reason over the next couple of months, Donald Trump decides to take a zero in on Japan, throws in more tariffs or demands that they, pay protection money to the U.S. to have bases there, something like that, which would be highly unpopular. I do think that even though I agree with Warwick, she doesn't necessarily have the strategic chops, or she hasn't showed them in the past. She could turn around, and this would change everything. And with her majority say, well, we're not going to become friends with China, but we're going to settle issues. We're going to adhere to a one China policy. We're going to take back the threat to Taiwan. I'm going to she makes a visit to China and says, look, we need to be trade partners, even if we're not necessarily closely aligned ideologically. This would send a very sharp message. Now, remember, this is unthinkable, correct? Well, that was unthinkable that you would have a Canadian prime minister get up at a forum and basically denounce the United States for its actions and admit that we've been going along with this charade for years simply because we thought it benefited us. Now it doesn't. And if you could have that kind of moment with her, where she takes something that Trump does very personally, or the policy is so repugnant she cannot swallow it. Remember, when you're a strong man, if somebody kicks you, you have to respond. So there are different challenges facing her. The question is, what is she going to do? What motivates her? I can guarantee you there's just no way I can see her economic policies, bearing fruit, not to the extent that she's made promises to everybody.
Japan has zero interest in a bad relationship with China, right? The interest is to have a working relationship, one way or another. But Warwick, the same question to you. What do you think China is going to make out of this now strengthened LDP situation over here?
Well, look, I think that the expectation of a strong LDP government being returned has been part of the thinking. Certainly, anybody watching Japanese politics would work on the basis that the LDP would form a government. The chances that the LDP doesn't is slim, to all but non-existent. That's the first thing. So I think you're always working on the basis that the LDP will form a government. The second thing I think has been clear in the polls prior to her calling the snap elections, and of course what looks like the results coming in, is that she has very, very strong personal following, and she's being able to parlay that into votes for her candidates or the candidates of the LDP in the lower house. So firstly, I think that there's nothing surprising out of this result that's going to cause anyone any particular palpitations. I think the assessment will be, firstly, that Japan just has real problems. The problems don't go away, whether you've got a small majority, a big majority, or what have you. The economic challenges remain the same. Long-term stagnation, lack of productivity, significant debt burdens, particularly in ways that don't contribute to production growth, but which drive asset growth, an aging population, energy constraints, food constraints. They're all there, and they're not going to go away. So ultimately, the question will be, how does Japan in the medium term navigate all of this? It obviously needs to find ways of having relatively peaceful relationships with its nearby neighbours to the extent that it can. Firstly, it relies upon many of them for economic inputs into their production processes. Secondly, many Japanese countries actually are only viable in Japan by virtue of the profits that they make from their production systems and investments in China. They're not making money because they're Japanese, they're making money because they're in China. So they're not going to want to rock the boat too much on that front either. And so firstly, I think they do need to have stable economic relationships. Let's not forget too that the Japan, ROK, Republic of Korea and China trilateral dynamics economically remain an important one that the parties ultimately from time to time continue working towards, particularly with a view to having a free trade agreement between the three, because they understand that it's actually in their mutual interests. The last thing that I'll just mention on this score is that, and this goes back to the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98, it is quite clear to every central banker and everyone in the economic portfolios of all three countries that they actually need to have ways of working closely together to ensure liquidity issues don't cause their respective economies major grief in the event that the United States seeks to shorten the availability of US dollars within the Asian region. Now, we've seen Scott Bessent in the last week talk publicly at congressional hearings about the fact that the United States literally caused a shortage of dollars in Iran specifically to catalyze inflation and ultimately create political unrest. So the United States clearly is willing to weaponize the dollar, and Japan and its bureaucrats in particular will be incredibly mindful that this is arguably the biggest risk that Japan actually faces. It's not China. It's not the Republic of Korea. It's actually the United States Treasury weaponizing the dollar and causing incredible grief to the Japanese economy writ large.
Yeah, they can do that. On the other hand, the Japanese also have a couple of cards in the hand because it's an interlinked system, right? The Japanese are, I think, the largest foreign investor in US
Sure.
stock market. But on the other hand, the ultra low interest rates in Japan recently led to this phenomenon that a lot of Japanese borrow in Japanese yen, convert to USD, and then invest there. And actually, we've got a question related to this one by one of our viewers, Arsenal Trill. The yen carry trade was holding the Japanese afloat for quite a while now. Those days are over. At the moment, they're still ongoing, but I hear from a lot of my sources that in Japan, people are quite sure that the BOJ, the central bank, is going to increase the interest rate at least by 0.25% this year, and that they probably will go in that direction just in order to combat inflation over here somehow, which would mean that the carry trade would probably might be a thing of the past. This is obviously not something that is directly influenced by the political actors. However, the LDP whatever's going to happen, it's going to rest on the LDP now being such a large majority. Einar, any views on this one?
Yeah, I mean, you have to also take into the fact that the dollar has depreciated. So that means in real dollar terms, if you start, if you lower the yen, sure, that's fine. You're okay in terms of your redemptions. But for the most of the world, under the first part, it was down 10% under Trump. That was a few months ago. Now we've seen another dip. How long can you devalue it? If I put $100 into treasuries at the beginning of this year, I would be down about 13, 14% right now. There's no interest rate that's going to cover that. That's currently being paid. So in addition to this issue of the carry trade, a lot of these entities would have to take markdowns on their returns on that, depending on what happens with the yen and things like this. So as I keep harping on, is that there are so many assumptions that have been made by her economic team, which just don't make sense. She's no attempt whatsoever to talk about how this massive 250% and growing, because she intends to spend, is ever going to be repaid. This idea that, oh, once Japan, becomes a powerhouse again. Well, this sounds like make America great again instead of make Japan great again. The fact is, there's no basis to do that. Companies are not going to be flocking back into Japan to do their manufacturing, as Powell said. They make money in China. They don't make money in Japan itself. So none of this, as I said, makes any sense to me. Perhaps there is somebody out there, but I've looked at her plan, tried to be very, neutral in terms of what it's there, but all I can come down to is that there are just incredible weaknesses in terms of the assumptions, and this is not going to work out well.
Warwick, same to you. Like the yen carry trade in the increase of inflation over here, increase also then of the expected interest rate by the BOJ, the way that this will dampen also maybe this plan of Takaichi to further weaken the yen. Although I must say, like, the yen has been going in one direction and one direction only, not only over the past decade, but over the past 90 years. The exchange rate yen to $1 USD in 1938 was 1-to-1. It goes in one direction. So the expectation is that we'll continue going there, but that can change. Warwick, how do you see it?
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, it goes back to the real economy, right? At some point, the economic structure actually needs to produce things that are useful to the people of the country, first and foremost. And secondly, produce things that are useful and competitive on global markets if you need to earn foreign exchange so that you can buy things that your country can't produce yourself. Now, Japan can't do two main things. It doesn't have enough food and it doesn't have enough energy. So it's going to need foreign exchange to secure both of those things. And right now, the risk it runs, particularly on this question of competitiveness through yen devaluation, is that the US is doing the same thing, right? So, and this goes back to my point earlier. Donald Trump is not in the business of helping Japan improve its export performance vis-a-vis the US. Right, that's not his modus operandi. So where does this leave the new LDP government, right, in terms of its broader economic strategy? As Einar said, I think it's an incoherent list of aspirations. They were easy things to sell when not critically scrutinized. It was literally a congenial grab bag of good ideas, but ultimately don't hold together in a meaningful and coherent policy framework that recognizes realities. And until a national government confronts those sorts of realities, it doesn't matter how big your majority is, you're going to stumble from one problem to the next. And I think we saw that under the Abe regime, where, as you said, he had an absolute monster of a political majority. It's a very serious mandate to do lots of things. And at the end of the day, struggled to ultimately make the transformations necessary, because these things are often, intractable issues, and ones which are intrinsically tied to your relationships internationally, right? So you can't just change your own domestic supply chain systems without addressing how you interact with others. And you can't go around creating problems with your upstream supply chain partners thinking that somehow there's going to be no blowback. And I think these are the problems that a much more complex world today demands attention from political leaders. And I'm not sure that a heavy metal rock and roll politician who's extremely popular actually necessarily has the capacity to have a framework to bring it forward, but also has a political capability of pulling it off as well. Because whilst on the surface of things, and you could probably tell us a little bit more detail, there's a thing called the LDP. The LDP itself is often racked by factions and disparate interests, right? It's not necessarily what you'd call a strongly unified thing. And whilst it has unified around the personality of the Prime Minister, those sorts of loyalties are ultimately incredibly fragile. You've got to keep succeeding to be able to hold that together. And the minute you've got problems, all of the enmities that existed previously, the vested interests, the ambitions, the hatreds, they'll all come back to the surface, and the backstabbing and the sniping and the press leaking, they'll all start to re-emerge. And lo and behold, what looked like an absolute whopper of a majority in 18 months turns out to be a lodestone that begins to fall apart on you. Why? Because the problems are actually greater than your capacity to deal with them.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be the first time that a strong prime minister then actually has to leave pretty quickly. I mean, the average shelf life of a prime minister over here is something around 2 years. Even relatively popular ones like the. I mean, Mr. Abe was really the longest one. It was about 5 or 6 years in office.
Pascal, look at it like this. Look at it like this. You're running a country that's relatively modern and sophisticated from a technology point of view, but you've got some chronic shortages of the two main things that all nations need, which is food and energy. You've got an aging population. You've got 90,000 troops from someone else occupying your territory under extraterritorial provisions. You've got economic relationships which are essentially tied to two major partners that actually pull in different directions. Where do you go, right? I mean, these are real problems. This is a Gordian knot that ultimately needs to be cut, but it requires political boldness. What she actually has is a mandate to do something about this on the back of a massive majority. Will she make use of that mandate, or will she squander this mandate? That ultimately is going to be the question. And it's a test that sits before her now over the next 6 to 12 months. Will this mandate be squandered? And for mine, I think the challenges are incredibly huge. I hope she can do something about it, because Japan needs to have a pathway that solves these strategic problems. It needs to find a way of extricating itself from the shadows of the Second World War and American occupation without causing the rest of the region to be concerned about Japanese remilitarization. It needs to find a way of reconciling Japan today with its history of atrocities, and to build fences and mend relationships across the region. It needs to do all of these things. And a politician with a big mandate, with a whole bunch of national goodwill, actually has the basis of doing this, but you've got to do it early. And if you don't do it early and you squander the window of opportunity, that window will be gone again.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, we are coming back to the real issues, and which includes the real economy and the actual ties to other nations, which obviously go hand in hand. Einar, maybe just to wrap it up, each one of you, and one more comment or observation with this. With these realities that are still very much stacked against Japan. Actually, one of the things that people over here over the last couple of weeks also said in interviews and so on is that they like Takaichi because she's strong and she projects being sure of herself, and that's something people look for when things go uncertain with the United States, with China, with the Asia Pacific, and you don't exactly know what's happening. So naturally, somebody who looks strong and dedicated then has a lot of appeal. If you had to give an advice to what you would hope this strong LDP government does, what would it be?
Well, as I said earlier, she's going to have to do, and I agree with Warwick, she has to do something out of the box very, very quickly. My assumption is that somehow Trump will antagonize her beyond a point where being a strong woman, she reacts. She has put forward Margaret Thatcher. You didn't mention the fact that she's also kind of a rebel. She's not at all, the picture of a Japanese, self-effacing woman. She got her husband to change his name to hers, although she's in favor of only one family name. It's a little unusual. And the way she talks is kind of, very basic. She's not into the kind of mumbo jumbo that the LDP has been engaged in the past, vague promises and things like that. She kind of throws it out there. But when I found out that she was the drummer of in a hard rock band, I couldn't help think about a movie in I think it was late 80s, 90s called This Is Spinal Tap, in which the standing joke was the drummer would routinely explode on stage and then promptly be replaced by somebody else. This is the danger that she faces right now, if she doesn't act within this honeymoon period and do something very strong. And I'm not saying that she has to jump one way or the other, but if she's provoked, she's going to have to find safe haven. And right now, the only place the place that is most beneficial to a relationship for Japan is not the United States, it's China. Massive markets, existing trade relations. And I'm not saying that because I live in China. I'm saying that because strategically, she has to somehow change the situation. When Warwick says what she needs to do, it needs to have a new direction. And that, unfortunately, is going to involve frictions one way or the other. Even if she jumps completely on the U.S. side, the question is, what is the U.S. going to do for her? If she jumps to the China side, it thinks, now, I'm not a proponent of countries jumping on one side or other. I don't believe that the switch is on or off, and I don't believe that Japan would just jump willy-nilly into the arms of China. It would be a very, very careful relationship if, in fact, comes about. But I really don't see how many different moves that she has, given the weakness of her economic plan. She's going to have to change the whole game board in order to find some way out for Japan.
I wonder, there's one more card that she could play, and that, in my view, would be quite something, and that's the Russia card, because they still have a joint drilling project in the Sakhalins for oil, and oil imports are going to be important going forward. The Russia is not being that heavily opposed by the Americans anymore. Japan never actually opposed Russia as heavily as the Europeans did or antagonized it. I wonder if that might be a pathway forward, but maybe let me just throw this out there. Warwick, the last word or the last piece of analysis goes to you. Please take it wherever you would like.
Well, that's great. I get to have the last word. That's cool. Look, because I can say something totally crazy, right? And won't get pulled up for it. Look, I've argued for a couple of years now that North Asia and Far Eastern Russia, Siberia, actually holds the keys to regional stability and security. Right. In large part, that's because it is the means by which Japan can have its core security problems satisfied, food and energy. It's also the means by which you have the major powers in the region coalesce around something of common interest. And as the region, the far east of Russia, or the northeast of China, or Siberia, however we want to describe it, becomes more accessible, its richness in terms of energy and its fertility in terms of agriculture really opens itself up. Now, let's not forget, not only do we have the Sakhalin project, which Japan maintains a joint venture relationship to, and in fact sought dispensation from its G7 partners to continue buying from. Japanese firms actually were quite engaged with the development of Siberia about 10 years ago. And much of that work and much of the business case work that was done in the lead up to, all of that engagement, I think remains relevant today, arguably even more so. And what you've actually got, and if you're politically bold, and this is the boldness that I think Einar was getting at, to grab that honeymoon window and leave your mark and shake the joint up. The boldness actually is going to come from saying we need to recalibrate our engagement in the entire regional architecture that will deliver, so I'm speaking, from a Japanese point of view, that will deliver for us our long-term security, which is food and energy, and which ultimately enables us to extricate ourselves from underneath the military yoke of a foreign occupying force and to be a standalone, autonomous, independent nation 100 years after the end of the Second World War, to once again be able to stand proud as a nation in and of its own right, as opposed to being seen as a vassal or a client state of a transatlantic power. And that's the opportunity that a big majority actually provides for a new Japanese prime minister who shakes the mold, right? She's not from the mold. And so there is a window of opportunity. The question is does she have the wherewithal and the political joie de vivre, you know, to grasp that moment and to leave a lasting legacy in this period of dramatic global transformation? Or she just becomes another LDP politician who promised a lot and ultimately faded away when her majority crumbled because she wasn't willing to tackle the issues in front of her.
Opportunities and risks. But thank you very much, both of you, for your assessments, also especially about the international dimension of this landslide that we've seen today. That was Einar Tangen, a senior fellow at the CIGI think tank, and Dr. Warwick Powell. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Pleasure.